All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and we'll let folks come in as they join. So welcome to Between Past and Future, Fermentation as a Living Tradition, our first April event here at MOFAD, the Museum of Food and Drink based in New York City. We are so glad you could all join us. I'm Casey Highsmith, Director of Communications here at MOFAD. A few housekeeping things, as I've already mentioned for folks, but I want to say them one more time for the last few folks coming in. You're welcome to have your video on or off. It's up to you, but we do ask that you remain muted. We'll be recording this program, and it will eventually land on our YouTube channel. You will also get a link in your email tomorrow. There's a chat function at the bottom of the screen. Please let us know where you're joining us from, and that is how you're going to drop your questions in for Q&A at the end. To give you a quick timeline for tonight, we're going to let Julia and Sandor speak and share, and around 7:35, we'll turn to some of your questions in the chat, and I'll remind y'all in the chat too when it's time to start throwing those questions in. So to give you some really quick, brief intros, tonight we are in the great company of two amazing fermentation experts. Author and founder and director of Root, a fermentation and food history company that bridges the gap between modern people and historic food, Dr. Julia Skinner explores the fascinating roots of a wide range of fermented foods and cultures around the world. And world-renowned fermentation revitalist and author of numerous books on fermentation, Sandor Katz. We are so thrilled to have them together to talk about Julia's new book and a bunch of other things I'm imagining, and talk about all your cool questions too after a little bit, and talk about the role of fermentation in our past, present, and future. So I'm going to hand it over to them and let y'all take it away.
All right, thank you so much. And I mean, I would only sort of add to what Casey just said that if something we're talking about makes you think of a question, feel free to write the questions down. You don't have to wait until the midway through when we sort of formally begin the Q&A part. I just want to show everybody the t-shirt that I'm wearing. I am in Tennessee. I'm actually not in my home because there's an impending thunderstorm and I've got some technical limitations, but Tennessee has been passing all of these crazy laws that, not only expand gun rights, but, they're really trying to sort of, narrow gender expression, and they're passing laws against people dressing in drag, against transgender people. And this is the governor of Tennessee, Bill Lee, who in his high school yearbook dressed in drag, for fun. And obviously, as a young person, he, had some idea that that was a fun way to express himself. But, now he thinks that it's very dangerous for anybody to express themselves in ways that sort of, deviate from traditional notions of gender expression. So, me and my friends are very caught up right now in, fighting against this slew of new legislation, basically scapegoating people who don't conform to typical gender expression. So I just wanted to explain my t-shirt. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Julia. And Julia and I have known each other for some years, and we have taught together. And Julia at one point came to one of my residency programs, and we've fermented a lot together. And I wrote the foreword to her wonderful book, Our Fermented Lives. And I just thought I would start by posing the question to you about, any family fermentation traditions in your family that were passed down to you, that you learned about, that, in that way, and that you've been able to carry on.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I talk about, I think in the introduction, I had always assumed the first ferment I ever had made was sauerkraut, which I started making as an adult. But as I started to kind of dig back through my memory banks a bit, I grew up making friendship bread. So I don't know if anybody here has ever made Amish friendship bread, but you get this baggie of starter and you add stuff to it for like a handful of days, and then you divide it up and you bake your loaves of bread, and then you give the starter to other people, and then you keep some starter. Yeah, and I mean, we made that over and over and over when I was a kid. And I, for some reason, because I didn't know what fermentation was, I was like, I don't know why we're adding all this milk and sugar to this thing, but whatever. Like, I never recognized it as fermentation, but that was that was probably the tradition that we passed on as far as making our own. Certainly we consumed plenty of other fermented stuff, but that was the one we made the most. What is yours? Did you grow up with any?
Well, I mean, I certainly grew up with lots of ferments, and I, the fermented food that really made the biggest impression on me as a kid was pickles. But we were buying them in a delicatessen. Nobody in my family was making them. I mean, like you with the friendship bread, I did not specifically know that they were fermented. I wasn't really thinking about how they were made. I mean, I think that most kids are, with the foods they like, aren't necessarily that tuned into how the foods that they're enjoying are made. And it was only later that I realized that the specific kinds of pickles that I loved were produced by fermentation. Lactic fermentation, never vinegar added. It's just, cucumbers in a saltwater brine with, garlic, dill, other seasonings. But I was very drawn to that flavor. Certainly, my mother's parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe, and as I got older, I started learning how to make some of my grandmother's wonderful things that she would make. I make noodle kugel in the style of my grandmother. There's an apple cake that she makes. Actually, this morning for breakfast, I made matzah brie. Tonight is the first night of Passover. But ferments were not specifically part of what I learned at that time.
Yeah. So when did you started fermenting when you moved to Tennessee, right? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's basically half my lifetime ago. So
Yeah.
that was this year marks 30 years that I've been living in Tennessee. And it really had to do, the catalyst for, me beginning to investigate how to ferment was having a garden. I knew already that I loved fermented foods. I already, when I lived in New York, had incorporated fermented foods into my daily life, when was developing ideas about, that they were good for me, that they were good for digestion, good for immune function. So I was really seeking them out, but it was really moving to a rural area and starting to garden that sort of gave me a practical reason to learn how to ferment. And it was really about the abundance of the garden and figuring out what to do with like a great row of cabbage that we had that first year that I was fermenting. And this light bulb went off that, oh, okay, fermentation is not only delicious and it's not only potentially beneficial to my health, but there's this very practical aspect that when you have too much of something at once, you can use fermentation to preserve it. And I was familiar with sauerkraut. I love to eat sauerkraut. And I looked in the joy of cooking to learn how to make sauerkraut. And it was ridiculously simple. And, I probably have always had at least one batch of vegetables fermenting, ever since that time 30 years ago. But that's what got me interested. How about you? What was your first, other than beyond the friendship bread? What was your next foray into fermentation?
So it's actually kind of a similar-ish story. I was in my early 20s. I was staying in an apartment that I had a little tiny apartment garden, but it was still, not having really had much of a garden before, it was still just such an abundance of food compared to what I was used to. And so I started fermenting sauerkraut. I started making hot sauces. I started making just all these lacto ferments. And then from there, I was like, I wonder what other stuff I can ferment. And this rabbit hole, yeah, it's still going. We've never reached the end of it.
It's a deep, deep rabbit hole. I don't think there's a bottom to this rabbit hole, Julia. So, through the years, I've learned from a lot of people. But I've also learned a huge amount from books, I have to say, and I'm just so grateful. I mean, they're not necessarily always books about fermentation. I mean, really, when you start looking at just cookbooks coming out of different culinary traditions, because fermentation is part of every culinary tradition, often you'll find aspects of fermentation in them. But there's also a really incredible literature, and I think it's always better if you can learn things from people, living traditions. That's the ideal scenario. But thankfully, there's also people writing this stuff down. And I just want to highlight two books that I've learned a huge amount from. One is H.T. Huang's huge volume from the Science and Civilization in China series published by the Cambridge University, and it's a volume 6 biology, volume 6 part 5 fermentations and food science. And this is just a deep dive into the incredible history of Chinese fermentation. And there's a lot, like just in the Chinese civilization, they were writing down a lot of detailed information about fermentation techniques thousands of years ago. And I'm just so grateful that this scholar has really made that accessible to English language readers, and that's an extraordinary thing. And another book that I love and I'm so indebted to is it's not a history book. It's the Indigenous Fermented Foods of the Sudan, and this is written by a biochemist named Hamid Dirar. And I mean, really, for years, I assumed he was an anthropologist, because he really approaches it like an anthropologist, and he's getting all of these stories, and he's getting sort of the details of how foods are made from the women who are making them. But it's, really an extraordinary documentation from a part of the world where, fermentation has just been extremely important and really linked to survival. And, as a result, they like everything is fermented in order to make it edible and useful. And I think that that's the bottom line of fermentation everywhere. It's just part of how people have made effective use of whatever kinds of food resources that are available to them. Now, Julia, I have the idea from either an email exchange we had or maybe something on Facebook, that in your recent travels in Ireland, you learned about some fermentation processes that you had not previously been aware of.
So so in Ireland, it was not so much when I was in Ireland recently, but rather when I was researching Scotland. So a jump over. But there was this ferment called cuisines, which is an oat ferment that I hadn't known about before. So my ancestors way back come from Aberdeenshire, and apparently in that area they make this fermented oat drink. And so basically what it is when you would mill up the oats, you would have a little bit of starch clinging left to those oat hulls, and they would ferment that to be like, give me all of that starch, like I want all of it. And so you would get this beverage, and then you'd get like this fermented kind of sour oat paste that you could turn into porridge and do other stuff with. And I think it's a beautiful example of all of the different ways that we've come up with to really get every last ounce of nutrition and every last usable bit out of our food using fermentation.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because in my most recent book, Fermentation Journeys, I write about something very similar, Cassill, which is the Belarusian word for a very similar kind of thing. It's not necessarily made from the hulls, but it's basically like you ferment the oats, and then you end up with two products. The soaking water is a beverage. I mean, it's just so delicious. I mean, it doesn't have quite the thickness of contemporary oat milk that you can buy, but it has the flavor of oatmeal and of contemporary oat milk, and it's just so delicious. And then meanwhile, you have these oats that have soaked for a couple of days, and then you cook those into a porridge, and it's just so creamy and rich and delicious. And I mean, I think just as a theme, the fermentation of cereal grains for porridges is just, it's had a huge role pretty much in every part of the world that I've been able to learn anything about, whether it's people in the Americas fermenting corn, or if it's people in, Africa fermenting sorghum or millet, or, people in Europe fermenting oats. It's very, very widespread. And, there's all these crazy studies looking at, like, the studies I've seen have been in contemporary Africa, but it's basically you get much higher survival of infants if they're weaned on fermented porridges rather than unfermented porridges. And, I think that there could be two components to it. One is that, they're getting more of the nutrition out of the grains if the grains are fermented. And then also because the grains are acidified to the extent that there could be, pathogenic bacteria, the acidity kills the pathogenic bacteria. And so, there's like just significant measurable improvements in infant survival. But even in any situation, like, we just get more if we ferment the grains before we make our porridges.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. The more, I mean, fermented grains is like a whole rabbit hole in and of itself. And it's always so fun to experiment with how different grains taste when you ferment them. Like I really, really love sorghum porridge. It's one of my favorites. I never would have thought that would be one of the grains I was most drawn to, but yeah, super, super good.
I've met a few people, in my travels. I've had the opportunity to do a lot of traveling around teaching about fermentation, and I keep running into Japanese people in particular, like Japanese people who are part of the Japanese diaspora, who, are teaching fermentation. As a way of as a means of cultural survival and cultural perpetuation, so that in their lives as as immigrants, in one case I know it's a guy who's living in Australia, a woman living in Canada, a woman living in Switzerland, but in their lives in these other places, that they can sort of pass on koji and miso making, and as a essential component of Japanese culture, to other Japanese immigrants to those places, or to just people who live in those places who don't have roots in Japan, but who have some interest in carrying on this this Japanese tradition. And I just think it's such a beautiful way of carrying on tradition, spreading tradition, getting new people interested in these traditional foods.
Yeah, well, and it kind of brings to mind a question that I've been obviously mulling about over and over while writing this, in sense of, okay, so we talk about fermentation as this living tradition. Like, one, what does that mean? And, two, how do we fit within that living tradition? Like, how do we bring that forward? I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, we have to keep doing it. And we have to find the people around us who are carrying them on. The thing is that people who migrate carry on their traditions. Like, they might not realize anyone outside their specific cultural background would be interested, but I think that it's in living people, and particularly in the context of global migration, that these traditions are alive. And I mean, not really particularly in the context of migration. I mean, obviously in different places, people are struggling with keeping food traditions alive. There's so much there's so much convenience food available. There's so much sort of allure of mass-produced foods that are advertised on television. There's just so many so many things competing with traditional foods. But even in places where there's been fewer and fewer people carrying on these traditions, I keep meeting young people who are eager to embrace the traditions, to relearn the traditions that maybe their parents didn't bother to learn. I don't know. What do you think? What do you see?
I mean, same. I'm, when I teach fermentation classes, I would say most of the people that come are younger generations who are like, hey, maybe my grandparents or great grandparents made this. I feel like we're at risk of losing this tradition, or I want to reconnect to that tradition. When you were talking about the migration, it kind of made me think of the ways that even on a small scale, we bring that forward. So the last time I was in Ireland, I was staying in a cottage with my partner, and I made akaraje and tapache while I was there, which are two things I actually learned at your house years ago, and then made over here in Ireland. And so now another person knows how to make them, and that tradition has carried on a bit. And so it's kind of on the most micro scales, when we choose to make these things and share them with people, we're still helping to carry those traditions on. And I think that's the part that's most important, because when we see these traditions, it feels like this big abstract thing, but a tradition is just made of each of us choosing to participate.
Yeah. And I think for, so many of us who are not, we're like, many of us today don't feel like we are, the recipients of a singular cultural tradition which we're carrying on. A lot of us are mutts, and we have various parents and grandparents and great grandparents that might come from a variety of different traditions, and we're sort of mixing and matching traditions and learning other traditions as we go. I had a really poignant exchange a few years ago. I was teaching in southwestern Alaska. And I spent some time with this Tlingit elder. And she was, in a very reminiscing way, talking about all these traditional foods that they were eating when she was a kid. But it was clear that, she felt like most of the traditions were gone. And, she attributed it to mixed culture. That sort of so many of the younger generations were had so much influence from outside of the culture, and no doubt that's true. But what was really interesting to me is her adult granddaughter, who was in the other room while we were talking, came out, and she was like, I would love to learn about that stuff. But it's hard because it's sort of like not very few people are doing it, and the younger people can only be exposed to what they actually witness people doing, unless they really take enormous initiative and track down the person who's still doing it.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of why, one of the big things I feel like I say over and over is like, this is why it matters so much for us to record and share what we do and be, actively whatever, write it down, teach a person, something. One of the things that was enlightening and frustrating about writing this book was just how many stories, could have gone in here, but we'll never know about because of, how many traditions maybe didn't make it, or how many people didn't write down. I mean, how many traditions weren't considered worth recording, even though a lot of people were doing them, but the people who were literate felt that they weren't, things that mattered. So it's, when we think about a living tradition, I think it's important too for us to recognize that the documentation of that tradition, watching and learning from people, I agree, is like always the best way, but documenting so we at least can have something is such an important part of it as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one new contemporary source is YouTube videos, and there's all these like there's all these like young people in China who are like documenting different food practices with YouTube videos, and people realizing that it's possible to earn a living if you get enough followers for the videos you're doing. But I that's another great rabbit hole you can go down,
Oh yeah.
obviously, but that's I mean, documentation these days does not have to be in writing.
Yeah, I mean, even there's so many people even just posting their experiments on, on Instagram or something. Like the Koji Builds community hashtag is one of my favorites, but there's, dozens of others. Yeah, I feel like every time I open social media, it's hard for me to set social media down because I know so many interesting fermentation folks who are sharing their experiments, and I'm like open it and I'm like, oh wow, like this thing and that thing. Yes, and as Corey mentions, some people even have blogs.
Hey, why don't you tell us a little bit about the books that you're working on now, your next books?
Yes. So I just a week or two ago signed 2 book contracts. My first time signing 2 book contracts in a row, so I'm feeling very excited about that. The first one is so for those of you who have The Hidden Cosmos, I self-published this a couple years ago, and it's a fermentation oracle deck and recipe deck. And my publisher, so I self-published this kind of as like a fun side project after I wrote Our Fermented Lives. My publisher liked it, and so now we're kind of reimagining it, reframing it. So there will be a fermentation oracle deck, but it's not the same one as this, and I'm collaborating with another illustrator. And so it'll be really interesting to see my ideas around, these interpretations of different ferments, but then in the hands of a different illustrator. I think that's going to be really cool. And then the other book is going to be this like huge food preservation handbook. Because it's me, there's going to be a lot of fermentation in there. There's also canning and all dehydrating and all of these things. So I get to kind of brush back up on all of those skills as well. But yeah, it's going to be very fermentation heavy and with an eye towards, again, some of this thinking about food within these larger traditions, simple tools, simple practices, and reducing food waste. I'm always big on cutting down on food waste.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's always, important to remind people that, fermentation is not, it doesn't just stand alone. I mean, it doesn't, fermented foods are not like better than every other kind of food. It's just like, it's part of a strategy for making effective use of food resources. And, a lot of fermentation processes, also involve, some level of drying or salting or sprouting. And so, you know, fermentation is you know, like an incredible, you know, obviously both of us have, you know, devoted ourselves to this process of fermentation, but, you know, it's sort of, it's part of something bigger. It's not just like, you know, it's not the thing in and of itself. It's you know, it's a way of using food. What do you make of all of the of this new world of precision fermentation and futuristic fermentation?
So for me personally, it wouldn't work for my practice. I'm very much a wild ferment, throw things in a jar, see what happens person. I think we're at an interesting moment because we are existing in a time where there's so much interest in this sort of like more traditional sort of stuff, like you and I do. And then there's also interest in this very precision, you know, we're isolating this yeast and replicating it in a lab sort of thing. And so we have both of these happening at once. And it's, I don't know, it'll be interesting to see kind of how that all plays out. I mean, what do you think?
You know, I mean, it's all curious to me. I mean, you know, I mean, you know, I mean, it's exciting, you know, if people can make, you know, plant-based, you know, meat-like products, and you know, if somehow precision fermentation can play a role in it. I mean, you know, I'm not against it, but you know, to me, it's really an anomaly, precision fermentation, because, you know, I am just forever, you know, just trying to help make people feel empowered about fermentation. And you know, fermentation does not come out of laboratories. You know, I mean, we've, you know, science has only begun to understand fermentation 150 years ago. And you know, all of the major fermented foods and beverages that we know, you know, are thousands of years old. And so, you know, people figured these things out, you know, in kitchens that did not have thermometers or scales, and you know, they really figured things out based on results, you know, and you know, our human powers of observation, trial and error. People, you know, sort of figured out methods that worked and passed them down. And I don't know. I mean, I feel like, you know, the history of fermentation that's exciting to me is anything but precise. And I'm always telling people, like, fermentation is not rocket science. Don't get too caught up on, you know, whether you use like 2% salt or 1.75% salt. You know, I mean, it doesn't matter. And the truth is, you know, for most things, salt it to taste, and you know, try not to stress about it. You know, but you know, I think that you know, it's great that you know, these new kinds of foods are being engineered. You know, personally, I'm always much more interested in, you know, ways that, you know, people in the grassroots can reclaim food, that it doesn't have to be something that happens in a laboratory or in mass production. But the reality is that most people are eating food that's coming out from mass production, and that's not a reality that I, you know, that I like, or that I want to participate in. You know, I mean, I can't help but be a little bit interested in, you know, the fact of some of these new technologies.
Yeah. No, it is very curious. I mean, like you said, to see the possibilities with it. And, you know, there's, as you were talking, I was thinking about conversations you and I have had in the past about fermentation being inherently democratic, and part of this empowering people being like, these microbes are everywhere. Like, nobody can own them. They're all over everything. Like, you just kind of have to make the environment for them to, you know, give you sauerkraut or give you whatever, and they'll do it.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, this is part of what the science of microbiology has illuminated, is that, you know, we live in this microbial world. You know, bacteria are the matrix for all life, and, you know, all multicellular life lives with bacteria. And so, all of the plants and all of the animals and all of the animal products that make up our food, they're all populated by microorganisms. And that's the reason why fermentation is everywhere, because there's a certain inevitability to microbial transformation of food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of in that vein, until folks, please start adding questions whenever you would like. I wanted to ask you about fermentation and food waste, because obviously it's a personal interest of mine, but it's another one of those rabbit holes that I feel like we can really go down. So for the people here who are thinking about, okay, I have a fermentation practice, maybe I want to think about how to reduce waste, like, what are the ways that we can encourage them to think about fermentation and food waste?
Well, part of it, I think, is a little bit of like trying to reconceptualize the question. Like, we don't have to have waste. Everything can be used in a variety of ways, and at different stages of its useful life, it might have different kinds of implications, and the byproduct of every process can have a place in some other process. So I don't know, and even the food that becomes so far gone that it just doesn't really, it's not appealing to turn it into something else. Well, then you can put it in the compost, and you can use it to increase fertility in your soil, and to grow the next generation of food. So I think part of it is just reconceptualizing, if we have bread that gets dry, well, there's all these things you can do with dry bread. Like, you could ferment it and you could make kvass. You could cut it into little cubes and dry it and make croutons. You can crush it up and make breadcrumbs. But there's it's just like everything that sort of passes one stage of its useful life can potentially be have some other use. And I think that once you have a fermentation practice, once you're sort of versed in some different fermentation processes, it becomes much easier to imagine what some of those sort of next uses of things could be.
Before we jump in, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to jump in before we jump into any of the questions that pop into the chat as you see them. We did have one that came directly to me. And it was just asking y'all to speak a little bit more about your book, Julia, your brand new book. Anything that you haven't already shared, of course, maybe kind of the direction it goes and kind of all the different lives that it includes, and that maybe more of the historical aspects.
You mean in this book, the current?
Yes, Our Fermented Lives.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry if I jumped into asking about the next book. But
No, those are really exciting books too, and I'm glad you plugged them, because that's really important too. They're all connected, right? But I think, speaking a little bit more to your Our Fermented Lives and kind of how you went through that, like the trajectory of that, maybe.
Yeah. So Our Fermented Lives, basically, it covers, it's impossible to cover the entire history of all fermentation, right? Like, I would be writing the book my entire life. But what it does do is it explores the different ways that people and microbes have collaborated across all of these different cultures over thousands and thousands of years. And I decided to explore that through a number of themes. And so I had thought about organizing it geographically, but what became clear pretty early on was, well, a lot of us are doing fermentation for very similar reasons. So it makes a lot more sense for us instead to think of this in terms of, say, preservation, food preservation, which we've talked about a good deal tonight. Community building, which is something I think a lot about. So when we think about like that tradition sharing and how that supports community building and passing on traditions and all of these things. And so that's kind of a very quick overview of it. It's global in scope because fermentation is global in scope. And it's something that I hope, I want people to use it as a wonderful reference. I want people to, read it and hopefully love it. But I hope people build on it. When we think about fermentation as a living tradition, this is a part of that, but it's not the be all and end all. Like, all of us are continuing to build on this and adding to this story and adding our lives to it. So that is what I hope that people get from it. A very quick and dirty overview.
And I think what's really unique about it is, you know, how the thematic organization of it. Like, you know, my books have been much more sort of like, you know, like nuts and bolts, like, okay, there's like, you know, there's vegetable ferments, there's, you know, grain ferments, there's bean ferments. And, you know, I've structured most of my work around like the type of food you're fermenting, which seems to me much more straightforward, but I really love the sort of the thematic spin that you've put on it in this book.
Thank you. Yeah, it was fun to explore through that way and to look at ferments that I was really familiar with and be like, okay, when we think of it thematically, like what, you know, why sauerkraut? Why this? Why that? So that was pretty fun.
Well, I see we've gotten a couple of questions. Okay. Graham asks, what is one ferment you suggest everyone try?
So I am going to give the most annoying answer here and say it depends. Which I say because, I mean, it's just such a broad world of foods, and we all have our own preferences. I mean, you know, dietary restrictions, all these things. All of us are already eating so many ferments all the time. I mean, we could spend a lot of time listing off, you know, bread, cheese, beer, miso, on and on. So I guess my answer is I don't have an answer to that. What is yours?
Well, you know, I mean, in terms of like getting started fermenting at home, I mean, I would say, you know, sauerkraut or fermented vegetables more broadly is certainly the most straightforward way to start. I mean, it's really straightforward and pretty much foolproof. Like I can explain in 20 seconds. You know, chop vegetables, salt them to taste, season as you like, spend a few minutes squeezing them or pounding them until they're juicy, and then once they're juicy, pack them into a vessel, get them submerged, and wait. You know, it's that simple. There's just no case history of food poisoning or illness. There's no, I mean, the process of fermentation makes vegetables safer than they are when they're raw. So, you know, in terms of like beginning a fermentation practice, I would always encourage people to just start with fermenting vegetables. Now, one ferment for everyone to try. You know, I mean, I think a lot and talk about you know, how fermentation creates some very strong flavors, and many of the flavors of fermentation are you know, what we might describe as acquired tastes. And I think that, you know, anyone from a Western background can relate to this in the realm of cheese, because, you know, we see that there's some cheeses that, like, you know, basically everybody likes, everybody who can tolerate dairy, and there's certain cheeses that, like, you know, some people love them, but many people are put off by the way that they smell, you know, if they even dare to taste them. One of the ferments that I did not like the first time I tried it, and it's a little bit notorious, but I have come to love and to crave, and I want to encourage anybody who hasn't tried it to just give it another chance, is natto. Natto is a Japanese soybean ferment. It's whole soybeans that are fermented. It's an example of an alkaline ferment. The bacteria Bacillus subtilis, which is present on all beans, it's common, it's in soil everywhere, probably on most plants and most vegetables that we eat, but it acts in this way on cooked beans. But you know, it has a little aroma of ammonia, like a ripe camembert cheese. And the first time I tried it, I was put off, but like, I love natto, and I think that, like, you know, we can acquire these tastes, and you know, for me, the key is like watching other people take pleasure in them. So for me with natto, it was like meeting some people who really loved natto and watching how they ate it, and then, and then feeling like, oh, I want to learn how to like enjoy that too. And, now I just can't get enough of it. And I crave it.
Yeah. No, I had a similar experience with natto. But yeah, now it's like so good.
Okay, the next question from Marilyn Beck. As a complete novice interested in delving a bit into fermentation, e.g. combo of cabbage, carrots, and ginger, etc., can you recommend a website or websites or just basic instructions to facilitate that process?
So, I mean, you just gave a very good 20-second overview of one way to do that. And I mean, again, I think that's the best place to start, right? Is just kind of grate things up, cut or chop them up, put them together with some salt, and wait. I mean, as far as websites or other resources, Kirsten and Christopher Shockey's Fermented Vegetable book, if you're looking for vegetables in particular, is a good one. I mean, I'm biased towards Sandor's Wild Fermentation book. But there's so many good resources out there now.
There's really a growing literature. I have a website too, wildfermentation.com, and there's so many like videos now. Like if there's something you want to learn how to make, you can just type it into your search engine, and you'll find instructions to make it. And I mean, not all instructions are equally good, but there's a lot of information that's freely available on the World Wide Web. There's a lot of excellent books. I mean, I mean, my books, Julia's books, the Shockey's books, but many other books. And, and really none of them are bad. Like you can learn fermentation basics from, any of the books that are out there. But, don't be intimidated. Don't wait until you know it all. Just like, just take some basic information and just you got to start, and really the process will teach you. There's only so much you can learn about fermentation, or I would say any kind of food, from just reading books. Like you have to start doing it with your hands.
Yeah. And I always remind people, there's not really any such thing as, failure in this. If your food doesn't turn out how you want, it's just a chance to learn more about the process.
Okay, what do you think an alternative, this is from Makeda, what do you think an alternative to people eating mass-produced food might be?
Well, I mean, I think, some of the stuff that I think about a lot is like community scale food sharing. So, community gardens, maybe sharing food with our neighbors, sharing expertise. I think just reimagining where we're getting our food from and how we're using it. I mean, that can look a lot of different ways. I think fermentation is a part of it. I think, as we were talking about reducing food waste and thinking of waste as kind of more of a modern problem and not an inevitability, is part of it. I think it can go, that's another big rabbit hole. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that parallel to our system of food mass production, there's lots of local food production. Now, there are economic realities where, most of the food produced on a small scale is more expensive than the food that is mass produced. But, these systems are existing in parallel. And there's a lot of grassroots efforts. I mean, certainly all around the US and in so many other places of, community food growing, farms doing community supported agriculture that have opportunities for work trades or people to participate in order to get some of the food that they're eating. And I think that, food does not have to be mass produced. This is sort of I think it began with the idea of like liberating us from toil in the soil. And then we have all this technology that's enabled like, one person to, farm, hundreds of acres of land. And it just doesn't have to be the way that we structure it. And I certainly don't know about, I'm not an expert in agricultural economics or anything like that, but I do think that, inevitably in the future, we are going to have like a devolution of agriculture and of food production. And, take something like oil pressing. This is something that's like really a pet peeve of mine, that like our oil pressing is just so centralized. But it doesn't have to be. I mean, I was like in China, in a like small rural market, I passed by a stand where somebody had a machine, it was a machine that probably cost, some thousands of dollars, but they just had this sort of like aromatic canola oil, like roasted canola oil that was fresh, that smelled so good. And we bought a bottle of it and it tasted so good. But, these things can be fresh, and there's no reason why, sort of every large town and small city couldn't have its own oil pressing operation. And that, we couldn't have a more decentralized system of, growing oil seeds. And so I just think in every realm of thinking about what we eat, we could be, sort of more oriented towards things that could be produced in our local area. How we get from A to B, like I can't really say, but I think that, this is the essence of, people reclaiming food from corporations that are, maximizing their profit. Like, okay, I mean, breakfast cereal out of a box is easier than making porridge. But, the corporations that are producing that cereal in the box are taking, this sort of like agricultural commodity and sort of, transforming it in ways you can't do at home and squeezing all of this profit out of it. And we're paying a lot of money for their processing. And that's really unnecessary as far as I'm concerned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have Tracy asks us, the idea of fermented food as a community, but also related to communities, the Amish friendship bread being an example, is really interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, sure. I mean, I can talk about that, and you certainly can talk.
We can both talk about it.
I think that, like, particularly in the United States of America, we have this myth of total self-sufficiency. And, there's like, people planning their, sort of escape from the rat race, and they think they're going to like move onto a piece of land and they're going to make everything for themselves. And that is just like utterly impossible. Like, nobody can grow all of their own food and, make their own bread and make their own beer and make their own cheese and make their own sauerkraut and make their own vinegar. Just like nobody can do that. And so I do believe that community self-sufficiency is possible, that regional self-sufficiency is possible, but it takes like, interdependency and ties and, some level of specialization. So not every house isn't going to have an oil press, but if every community had an oil press, and every community needs a baker, and every community needs a cheese maker. And, I think that, this is, this is how, sort of food systems are born.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think we see more either in practice, or we see more receptiveness towards that idea, like you said, outside of the US. It's really interesting to me to think about, having grown food and having raised animals and having done all these things. Like, it would be really exhausting for me to try to do all of that for every single thing that I needed to eat. And so that, again, that community interdependence, I think that's that's a great place to kind of focus, and just, it's such a big area we can talk about, but I think that's a good little spot to leave it.
I want to say one other thing, which
Mhm.
is that, I mean, in the US, people are doing this in different ways. I visited a couple of times a farm in Vermont, Flack Family Farm, that has like a little sauerkraut and kimchi business, from vegetables that they're growing, but they don't have any big machinery to shred the vegetables. They basically have community production days, and they invite people, sort of from their area and the people in the region who buy their products, to come out on the farm for a few processing days. And everybody's got like graters and knives and cutting boards, and they're all shredding cabbage together and salting it and making the kraut, and then everyone can take home a bucket of kraut with them, in exchange for their participation in this community activity. And to me, this sort of echoes what I've heard about from Korea, where Kim Jong is a big is like a period when after the cabbage harvest, when everybody's making their kimchi, and families and neighbors come together. And in Seoul, there's like a giant like mass street kimchi making. But these things can happen at every scale. But processing food is a lot of work, and bringing people together to share in that work is just the way people have done it everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have time for that last question, and then we'll wrap it up for the night.
All right. So our last question is, do you have any ideas or thoughts on using fermentation in creating plant-based protein? So my answer, I'm not a plant-based protein production expert. So I'm not like a manufactured food expert by any means. But it can change the food structurally. It can, it adds a lot of flavor. I think that's a big important thing. Sandor, what do you think?
Well, I've been making tempeh for 25 years and teaching people about making tempeh, and tempeh is one example of this. I think that there's a lot of like traditional examples of fermentation being part of how people deal with plant proteins, make plant proteins more digestible. Really, since I was in China, I've really gone down the rabbit hole of like furu, fermented tofu. It's just like a whole amazing, exciting culinary world. And so, there's a lot of like traditions in which fermentation's been used as a sort of means of making plant-based proteins more flavorful and more digestible. But then there is this whole new industry that's developing, and that's what we were talking about before. And I guess we were mostly talking about it in this sort of coded language of precision fermentation. But I have first of all, I'd say that outside of precision fermentation, just because more people are doing it, I've been having better and better vegan cheeses. I feel like more people are really figuring out how to incorporate the sort of funkiness of fermentation into various kinds of plant-based cheese products. But now there's this whole industry that's using precision fermentation in order to make meat-like products out of different kinds of plant substrates. So to me that's interesting, but it's not something I know much about at all.
Yeah, likewise.
Well, that can be the next journey of y'all's fermentation journey. Next part of it. Well, thank you all so much for coming. That is it for tonight. We appreciate all of y'all being here. We appreciate our speakers for the night, and watch your email tomorrow for a link for the recording in case you want to catch all of that again and get all the answers to your questions. Thank you so much, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you.
Have a good night.